Go ahead.
Well, welcome. I'm Lee Barrett from Lancaster Theological Seminary, where I teach theology, and it was pointed out this is, I think, my 29th Lent, in which I've been doing some series here at Derry Presbyterian. For today and the next 4 weeks, we're going to be discussing the impact of technology on Christianity and the life of the church. And not just that technology affects the way we communicate with one another, but rather it actually affects the way we form community and even the contents of the faith. And to put that, and we're going to look at a variety of technologies. Today it's going to be mostly communications technologies, but we're also going to look at artificial intelligence in subsequent weeks, and also changes in transportation and in industry. This is not the first time that technological developments have affected Christianity. It's happened several times before. In fact, it started in the get-go. In the period of the early church, there was a shift from storing information, including sacred texts, in scrolls and shifting to books, which made a huge difference. Because if you ever go online and have to scroll down with no page numbers, it's hard to skip around and find your place. So when people were using scrolls, they couldn't flip back and forth from one biblical passage to another. They tried to memorize it because it was too much trouble to find it. You'd have to unwind and wind, and you'd never know quite where you were. So it was difficult to compare different portions of the Bible to one another. But with the development of books, you could flip pages. And so that made it possible for folk to see, oh, there are some tensions and differences in different parts of the Bible, and begin to analyze those. So that was actually a big deal. And books were much easier to transport than scrolls. You could get in the Middle Ages, you could be in a carriage and open a book, but you couldn't unravel a scroll. And books were also cheaper to produce than scrolls, so more people had them. The big change in technology that is partly responsible for us being here in the Presbyterian Church was the development of printing. The Protestant Reformation probably would not have happened had there not been printing. Because with printing, Martin Luther and then later the messages of folk like John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli could be disseminated widely. And Luther recognized that. So Lutherans began to, almost from the get-go, produce little sort of like propaganda pamphlets that were cheap and could even be distributed free, whereas Roman Catholics were not doing that. So the Lutheran Reformation spread quickly thanks to the development of printing. And with printing went, since books were available and newspapers were available and pamphlets were available, literacy also became much more desirable, and many more people became literate. If that had not happened, most people would have stayed Catholic. And then the next big technological transformation was the radio, in which it became evident that in order to hear a sermon, you didn't necessarily have to go to church. And we're still living in the aftermath and the acceleration of that phenomenon. The notion that you can stay home and worship in private by listening to a preacher on the radio. So in the 1920s and 30s, that led to an actual decline in church attendance, and religion became much more private. You didn't necessarily have to interact with like a session or a congregation or a subcommittee. You could stay home and turn on the radio, and when the preacher was done, you could change the station, and nobody would bother you. So it was much less intrusive and much more convenient, and didn't put any demands on you. You just had to turn on the knob. You didn't necessarily have to contribute anything to the life of a congregation. And then, of course, in the early 1950s, television. And that changed, again, the face of religion in North America and probably around the world. In that, television is a medium that operates on motion. I mean, that's the whole point. You see things move. Protestants and Roman Catholics initially had trouble adjusting to that and figuring out that that was a big deal. So you may remember back in the 50s when there was mandatory religious programming, usually right before a station would go off the air late at night, they'd have Bishop Fulton Sheen, or usually a Protestant minister with a British accent, possibly a Scottish accent, coming on at 2 a.m., and then there would be the Star-Spangled Banner, and the station would sign off. What the mainline Protestants and Catholics were doing were basically just having little mini sermons and lectures. They went talking heads. That was not popular. And a lot of denominations in the 50s and 60s put on Sunday morning, when again there were regulations that said you had to do some religious programming, they put on more talking heads in programs that you might remember with names like Look Up and Live, Lamp Unto My Feet, early Sunday morning programs, usually a half hour or an hour long, but all talking heads. Meanwhile, evangelicals, and even more dramatically, Pentecostals, realized that the point of television is to see motion, not to watch talking heads. They had motion. They moved around, they jumped around. If you remember, Oral Roberts and other televangelists would have tent meetings and call people forward who were allegedly lame or blind, and put their hands on the person, and the person would fall over backwards, slain in the spirit, and get up and throw away their crutches and jump around. Or people would start to speak in tongues or dance. So there was motion. TV viewers liked that. So they started to watch, not the Protestants who were just talking heads, they started to watch the action from the evangelicals and the Pentecostals. Even when they did have a talking head, like Billy Graham at a crusade, there was always motion. People coming forward, accepting Christ as their Lord and Savior and receiving a blessing from Graham. So there was always motion, and particularly with the Pentecostals, with healing and dancing and speaking in tongues and being slain in the Spirit. How many have ever been to a Pentecostal service? Okay, there's a lot of action. It's not like Derry Presbyterian. A lot of movement. And I was invited several times to speak in a Pentecostal church. And the first time I did, I was told that not only are you going to give the sermon, but you're going to be a catcher. And I thought, what's a catcher? Are we playing softball afterwards? And they said, no. We're going to invite people to come forward and receive a blessing, and many will be slain in the Spirit and will fall over backwards. So your task is to stand behind them and catch them so that they don't hit the ground. The first person who came forward, whom I had to stand behind to catch, was like 6'7" and 350 pounds. So he was slain in the Spirit. I put his hand on his forehead, and the guy went over backwards and took me with him. So we both went down, and the pastor who was doing the slaying in the Spirit announced that, "Hallelujah, the catcher has been slain." So anyway,
there's action.
Yeah, there's action, and we know from evolutionary biology that our brains are still hardwired to be riveted to action. From the prehistoric days, or even not that long ago, when we always had to detect motion in the forest, because there might be a predator there. There was danger, so we always had to be on the lookout. I grew up in the streets of New Jersey, so I'm very sensitive to motion, movement in the shadows. So it's very difficult to look away if there's a lot of motion going on. if you've ever been in a sports bar, you probably have, it's hard not to look at the screen. So television tended to favor evangelicals and Pentecostals. That viewing audience went up, and still is. And the talking head, sermonic, lecturing, mainline Protestants like Presbyterians and Lutherans and Episcopalians, that viewing audience went down to the point where it virtually disappeared. And the FCC regulations changed, and there are basically no more talking heads from the Protestant main line on major television services. So those were ways in which technology inadvertently influenced Christianity, from scrolls to books to print. That was probably the really big one. Then radio, and then television. And now, of course, we're in a new technological revolution with more electronic media, the internet, social media. And that's having a profound effect on our surrounding culture, and therefore on Christianity and the life of the church. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I'll invite your reflections on these. I'm going to try to stress both the positives and the negatives. But things are changing, and they're changing fast, probably faster than most of us can adapt to them. I just saw the new technology here, which frightens me. I confess that I am probably one of the few people in the world that does not have a cell phone or any kind of mobile device. And I don't know why, I'm just stubborn. But first I'm going to talk about changes in the culture. The way in which changes in technology have changed the culture in which we live, and therefore will have and is having an impact on the church. And I'll try to present both pros and cons. Of course, and you live with these every day, and you're probably well aware of them, so I'm just pointing out the obvious. Number one, proliferation of options. It's no longer the case, and hasn't been for quite some time, that there are 4 major networks on television and a couple of small ones. It's not, there's PBS, NBC, ABC, CBS, and maybe a local station. Rather, you have hundreds of options in a variety of ways, and can watch anything you want, which means that, among other things, a common core of information and values has disappeared. You may remember when most of the country got their news from Walter Cronkite, and that what Cronkite said was usually regarded as gospel, or at least something you had to take into account. Remember when Cronkite mentioned that he no longer trusted the Johnson administration because they seemed to be lying about the casualty rate in Vietnam. It was then that the nation took a very sharp anti-Vietnam War turn. It was largely because of Cronkite. That's all gone. There is no figure like that everybody is familiar with or listens to. So instead what we have is the splintering of sources of information and values, the siloing effect, that no matter who you are or what you happen to believe, you can find online somewhere a group that will reinforce that. And so the promise of the internet that would lead to all sorts of exciting and healthy interactions of different ideologies and different positions and even different religions, that didn't really happen. Instead, people just found the spot on the internet that was comfortable for them, and they stayed with it and would just reinforce their own biases and ideologies. It started long ago with, so MSNBC versus Fox. But then it's splintered infinitely more than that, so that there is no common core of information and no common value system. And that has led to polarization and fragmentation in the culture. And that eventually is something that Christianity is going to have to deal with. What do we do when folk in denominations or in congregations have very different sources of information and therefore very different understandings of what's going on in the world? Another big result of the internet revolution is the rise of anonymity. That you can go online and say things that you never would say in public to people you knew. You can be insulting, you can be vicious, you can be threatening, and there's nothing that can be done about it unless Elon Musk and folk like that start to monitor it better. So the notion that you are not responsible for what you say. You can say anything you want, and there will probably be no negative repercussions, which leads also to a general sense of diminution of responsibility, that I can get away with anything. Who's going to catch me? Who's going to punish me? Which erodes a kind of moral sense. And what some psychologists have discovered is the folk who seem to be telling egregious lies on the internet and making things up, after they've done it enough, they actually believe themselves. And they don't remember that, oh, I made this up. They start to think it was absolutely true. So the notion of truth and responsibility are being eroded. And that will have enormous consequences for Christianity. Because Christianity is always traded on the notion that you are a moral agent, you have responsibilities to God and neighbor, and you should be self-critical, self-evaluative, and in Lent, you should think about your sinfulness and repent. But if you can't tell the difference between yourself making something up and yourself being truthful, how are you going to repent? You don't even remember that you did anything wrong, what used to be called lying, but is now alternative facts. So anonymity, and the danger that that can do, especially in junior high and high school, where you can ridicule and vilify a classmate online and get away with it, that's a serious problem. And it leads to people who are on the vilification end, who get vilified. It leads to depression and a spike in teenage suicide. Another thing about Facebook and all the online services is it encourages self-creation. That online, you can be anybody you want. On dating services, you can Photoshop and fix your face to be the way you want it to be, or put in somebody else's face. And you can make things up about yourself. You can create your own identity. You can exaggerate. And it seems that in younger generations, that's becoming the norm. And the notion that you should have an actual identity that's stable and is yours and it's yours responsibility, that is also being eroded. And you can see that, I won't name names, but you can see that with politicians in a major way these days, where you can just make up facts about yourself. You know, I worked for so-and-so. I held such and such a position. I graduated from such and such a place. I'm a volleyball champion. I'd like to go online and say, I'm an NLF quarterback, and see if anybody believes it. But that sort of like self-creation, inventing your own identity is your right. That has become widespread, particularly with younger generations. And that also erodes a sense of responsibility, that you are who you are, and you need to admit that and live up to it. And another consequence, I will get to some good things, but another possibly negative consequence is a sharp decline in attention span amongst younger folk. I taught at a local college, Franklin and Marshall, as an adjunct for a while, and they gave me training on how to deal with Generation Z. And I had to go to workshops, like what are the characters, Generation Z are the folk who are in college right now. So I had to go to a workshop to discover their characteristics. As one workshop leader said, they have the attention span of a slug. That it is actually about 17 seconds. If something takes more than 17 seconds to say or explain, their minds have drifted off, because they are used to looking at something quickly online and then clicking to something else. So something online holds people's attention for a very brief period. And so in teaching, you have to, I was exhorted to change activities every couple of minutes. Never lecture for more than 2 minutes, and then shift to a small group discussion, or stand on your head, or do something to keep them interested, because they won't continue to listen to a lecture, nor will they continue to read something for that long. Now that's got profound implications for how we worship, because most mainline Protestants are still in the mode of the 12 to 20 minute sermon. But with younger generations, for 90% of that sermon, they've tuned out. They heard the first minute or two and then started to think about something else. So it throws into question, are sermons going to work in the future? Or should there be some other mode of communication, just because of that diminution in attention span? It also affects the way people read. And this is one thing I found was really weird with my college students. They're used to seeing things online. So they're used to seeing pages online. And most pages have a picture. And usually the picture is in the middle of the right-hand column. So what younger folk learn to do is just skim the left-hand column and skip all the words to the right, so that they read sentence fragments and not entire sentences. And sometimes their eye movement will go across the top, but then it will go down the left-hand side, and then maybe along the bottom, but it won't go to that place on a page where there is usually a picture online. So I was told, never just give them a page. Give them a page that's shaped like that. Ooh, I touched it. It came alive. Another issue that's arisen is the evaporation of a sense of logic, because folk are young people become accustomed to seeing something, then getting interested in it.
You got it.
And if I touch it again, will it go off?
Yep. The moon or the thing.
Oh, thank you. Now you see, as long as that was up there, even though that wasn't moving, you had to look at it. Imagine if those things moved around. It is a sense of linearity and logic is also becoming an antique. Because folk will click on something, and then they'll get interested in some aspect of it, and then click on something else, click on another link. So they learn to think associatively rather than linearly. there's a classic joke about it from philosophy departments that, the old syllogism, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's standard syllogism pattern. Well, it was said that way kids think now, or anyone who uses the internet a lot, is more associative. So that Socrates is a man, all men are mortal. I saw a dead aardvark once. It was immortal, and therefore Socrates is an aardvark. And people get accustomed to thinking in those patterns of association, rather than A leads to B and B leads to C. And ability in algebra and geometry has declined. That's just gone over the cliff. Because in those disciplines you have to really think in a linear way to complete a geometric proof. You can't just say, that looks like a triangle. Triangles remind me of pyramids, therefore this is Pharaoh. And one other, there's a couple of other negatives of the technological revolution in communications is the availability of escapism. That actually the number of folk who go to professional counseling in younger generations has declined. And one theory is what people do who have grown up with the internet is if they feel depressed or anxious, rather than talking to a human being about it, a friend, a family member, or a professional counselor, they just play a video game. That amusement is at their fingertips. Say, okay, I'm feeling bad about something or other. Well, I'll just try to forget about it by playing this new game or going on this website. So that escaping from one's life situation becomes very, very easy. People have always done that. They're trying to forget their problems by, there was a book about 40 years ago called Amusing Ourselves to Death, where we turn to amusement in order to avoid confronting our existential dilemmas. But now it's really easy to forget your problems. You don't have to go to Hershey Park, and you don't have to walk the Appalachian Trail. You can just go online. And especially if the images move, you'll be riveted and you'll feel better and forget, at least temporarily, about whatever it was that was bothering you. And then that becomes addictive. So that whenever you feel anxious, you do that more and more. Spend more and more time online and less time actually dealing with things. And the last one I'll talk about is the phenomenon of isolation. And that's been very much documented in regard to younger people, where instead of going out, joining a team, or even hanging around with friends, the tendency is to stay home and go online, which, according to some evolutionary biologists, is very detrimental because we are intrinsically, we human beings, herd animals. Started out in prehistoric times when, in order to bring down a woolly mammoth, you had to have a team of people cooperating with one another physically. So it seems that we're hardwired to want to interact with people physically. That's why there are teams. That's why you're here now. You could have stayed home, and this is going to be available online in various formats. So you didn't have to come here. Why did you come here? Because you've got a herd instinct. You want to bring down the woolly mammoth, and you can't do it by yourself. So we have communal instincts almost, which if you ignore them and stay home and just go online, you're going to get weird pretty quickly. And that is happening with folk in the younger generations, and leads to the spike in depression, anxiety, and even suicide. So, but there are benefits. I mean, it is possible to communicate much more easily. We have more meetings. There's less time needed for travel. Yeah, I said there are more meetings. Yeah, I guess that's not really, maybe that should be a con. No longer do you have to travel to Japan in order to have an international meeting. You can do almost anything online now. So that does, in a way, make the world a smaller place, and that's a good thing. And the opportunities to find information have been exponentially increased, so that you don't have to go to the Library of Congress anymore. You can find whatever you want pretty much a click away online. So that makes research, writing, much more easy and much more rigorous too. Because there's more information, because you should take into account all the relevant information in the world, not just the relevant information in the libraries around you or what you can get through interlibrary loan. So there are indeed a lot of benefits. And I want to talk about now the pros and cons in regard to the church in particular. We've been talking about the general culture, to which the church must adapt or be left behind. Okay, first I'll do the cons again for the life of the church, and then the pros. And they parallel what's going on in the general culture. Number one, because folk can zoom in, which is a good thing, which we'll see, and that's got a lot of benefits, but because folk can zoom in, interactions are becoming more disembodied. It's more like we're spirits floating on a screen, where we don't have to physically greet one another or pass the peace with a handshake or a nod or a hand at the heart. Don't have to make small talk, which is often very, very important, in the corridors, over coffee, over donuts, in the parking lot. So the ways in which people can interact is diminished pretty sharply for churches. And there is some soft data, because it's too early to tell what's really going on, that the people initially like the notion that you can stay home and go to church on Zoom, because you can be in your pajamas, drink coffee, you can turn off the video, you can multitask if you don't like the sermon. But after a while, they get tired of that and either go back to coming in person or else just drop out of church entirely. So the notion of disembodiment is problematic for the lives of congregations. And this is a little surprising, but the use of technology in churches, particularly Zoom services, make things less informal. I mean, they're more informal in that you can stay in your pajamas, but you can't really talk to folk without setting it up in an intentional way. Like, I want to talk to you, so let's have a chat room. You just don't bump into people and have a conversation about what was on the sermon. You have to set up the conversation. And if you ever, I don't know if Derry ever did this, but back in the days of COVID, when most churches were entirely shut down, many tried to have coffee hour on Zoom. So you had 50 little tiles, and a chat box. And that was very, very unsatisfying and artificial. And along with the disembodiment is the ways in which communication can happen are also curtailed. Body language is hard to read on a screen. And body language is often necessary, particularly in regard to humor and irony. You know, this hurt me a lot as a professor using Zoom. I'd say something ironic, you know, like your paper is due in 10 minutes. And, you know, and students would freak out because they couldn't see that I had a twinkle in my eye and that I was smiling sort of. And a lot of our interactions require not just seeing facial expressions or hearing words, but also reading the entire body. Is the person tense? Is the person relaxed? And you can't do that with Zoom. It also has reduced, I'm talking about Zoom worship services, it's reduced the sensory impact. Because it's one thing to watch a service on a screen. It's another thing to be in the room. Because when you're in the room, all sorts of memories are triggered by even smells. You know, this smells like the church of my childhood. And you can look around and see images in the stained glass windows. You can look at the shadows in the ceiling that might be kind of mysterious if it's a Gothic church. So there, and you can, you know, hear the creak of the oak pews in many situations. So with the screen, all you can do is see what's in the camera. You can't even turn your head to see something different. So that diminishes the impact of sound, smell, and all kinds of kinesthetic sensations, just like, you know, this pew feels like the pew I knew 20 years ago. All that's gone. And there are some things that really don't work well on Zoom, although they may be necessary. One is communion. Zoom communion is usually degenerated to the pastor, like let's say it's a hybrid where there is a live congregation, but there are also folk on Zoom, where the pastor, you know, consecrates the elements and drinks and distributes to the folk there the juice or wine and the bread. And for the people at home says, okay, now it's time for you to eat and drink whatever you have in front of you. You know, that really diminishes the difference between the sacred and the profane, the ordinary and the extraordinary. You know, where, you know, I've participated in Zoom communions where, you know, it became time for communion. I'd forgotten to bring anything, so there's a fragment of a hot dog, you know, and a swallow of beer. So, you know, that's what I had available. But that undermines the sense that this is sacred. You know, this is different. This isn't just like sitting in my armchair and snacking out or having a drink. But we've gone to a special place and we're all doing this together. And we're all having the same experience. It's also very, very hard to have moments of silence on Zoom. Because when there's a screen, we're used to something on it. You know, if the screen goes blank, it's time to change the station. So if say we're going to have no images and we're going to have silence, we'd like silence prayer. Very hard, it's very uncomfortable to be at home and watching that on a screen. So now you're probably thinking that I'm just a Luddite and I hate technology and I wish this would all go away and you shouldn't have gotten this. But no, because there are very serious pros to the internet. And the obvious one is that you can reach more people. You can reach folk who have to stay home, folk who are sick, folk who are in nursing homes, folk who are not ambulatory. And that's an enormous plus, and that should be celebrated. And that's such a strong plus, it might outweigh most of the negatives.
During COVID, that was important.
Oh yeah, in COVID it was essential. No, I taught on Zoom for about 2 years and never saw anybody face to face. And when they finally came back after COVID, I was shocked. I just blurted out things like, I didn't know you were that tall. And even worse, I didn't know you were that heavy. That was great. And it also has enabled congregations to transcend space and geography, where sociologists are discovering that some folk, when they move to a different part of the country, they retain their membership in the congregation from which they came, and they retain electronic communication with them. They Zoom in for the worship service. I bet that's happened here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that you probably have people who are in California or Japan who are Zooming in, who otherwise would have had to have joined a local congregation. So now you're not restricted to whatever local congregation is in your neighborhood. You can retain contact with congregations that you've loved, but the exigencies of your life forced you to move. And you can also shop around more and find a congregation that feeds your spirituality, even if it's not in your neighborhood. So that's becoming a thing, where congregational membership is growing amongst people who have never seen the congregation, never physically been there, never physically seen anybody from there, but they like the style of worship, they like the message, they like the common life, and so they join by Zoom. Another positive of electronic communication is that it tends to liberate introverts. Introverts in a small group like this, if we were having a discussion, introverts tend to be silent. However, online, they do enter chat boxes and will type things in and are more apt to speak out if they're not physically present. So many introverts, actually I had introverted students, I mean seriously introverted students. I thought they were mute. But they would, when the COVID restrictions were lifted and we had face-to-face classes again, they said, I need therapy. And we thought students might need therapy because they had been damaged by not seeing people, not interacting face-to-face. These were people who said, no, I really liked being alone. And I felt liberated, and I could respond, and I could participate in conversations. And now with these bodies around me, I'm frightened and intimidated, and I wish we had never gone back to face-to-face. So it tends to enable folk who are by nature on the introverted side of life participate more and feel less tentative. And another factor is simply convenience. Folk have to travel. Sometimes they can't be physically present in a worship service, even if they're not sick. Things can be recorded as they are now and can watch them later. So that if you have to physically miss a face-to-face meeting, that's not the end of the world. You don't have to ask somebody what happened. You don't have to read the minutes. If you're on a session, you can and you're on a business trip, you can still Zoom in and be part of the meeting. And so that makes corporate life of congregations and denominations much, much easier. And on the denominational level, that's crucial. Denominations used to spend a ton of money flying people around to meetings. Now, they don't have to. You just have a Zoom meeting. So you don't have to, if you're a Presbyterian, you don't have to buy a ticket from Philadelphia to Louisville or have the National Church buy it for you. Just go on Zoom and it costs nothing. So it's much more economical. So all those things, I think, speak in favor of the electronic media's use by congregations and by denominations. It enables folk who otherwise couldn't be there to be present, shut-ins, folk who are sick. It enables folk who have moved to remain part of common life. It expands the options of congregations you can join. It empowers introverts to participate. And it's convenient and in many instances economical. So what I've tried to do is just present both the pros and the cons. The thing that I think congregations are going to have to do is figure out how can you compensate for the lack of face-to-face contact if most of the folk are on Zoom, or if, in some congregations, have sold their building and gone entirely virtual. How are you going to have the physical contact that people seem to need and want? And how are you going to prevent or work against the fact that there are declining attention spans, a greater sense of isolation, and a greater tendency to seek amusement and escape from life's problems by going online, and the anonymity and the problem of self-creation. I don't have to be who I am, I can be anybody. I just have to invent a persona for the internet. So there are problems that are present in the culture, particularly among younger people who have grown up with the internet, but there are also opportunities. A big one I always worry about is, what are we going to do with sermons? Yeah. Sermons are going to seem antiquated, and lectures, which is my bread and butter. I'm lecturing right now. In fact, I've lectured for 45 minutes. Like, if you were part of the Generation Z, you would have been with me for 43 minutes, and then you drifted off somewhere else. What are we going to do about that? Will the sermon remain the centerpiece of worship, or will there have to be more diverse phenomena going on in worship? So I hope I've been fair and presented pros and cons. And now I'd like to invite general conversation, observations. Yeah.
You've taught at F&M.
Yeah.
How long have you taught?
Well, my position is at Lancaster Seminary across the street, but I've been adjuncting there off and on for 25 years.
Have you seen a major change in the students as
Yes.
far as everything?
Yes. Oh, yes. And what's most evident is the attention span thing
Yes.
and linear thinking.
I applaud you said you were stubborn earlier as far as cell phone and everything. I applaud that. I would be exactly like you if I didn't have to have a cell phone because of business and other things. I would be just like you. And I wish I could be like you.
I discovered I can't be like me much longer because the university that my seminary is affiliated with just started a new educational platform that has dual authentication, so that you type in your password, but then it says, we're going to send a message to your cell phone, and you have to click on the cell phone. So, so far I've just been saying, I can't read any messages.
Thank you.
Yeah.
As your basic hyperactive person, I know I'm a little old for that, but still seem to be afflicted by it. Concentration span is a difficulty, and you tend to look at the shiny object.
Mm-hmm.
What you were talking about in terms of motion is certainly a piece of it, and if there's a lot of motion going on when I'm trying to work on something else, I have problem focusing on that which I'm doing because there's all this other stuff I'm trying to bring into the same experience. So at any given point in time, my head is a noisy place. But it is. But one of the things when you're talking about teaching kids who have that kind of a problem, the trick is to create a constant shiny object,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can constantly bring them back into it by these constant bright things, which just helps them focus on what's going on, which I think is what they were talking about in terms of training. But in all honesty, when you start talking about that concentration and the difference with the different media, at the extreme, and we're not there yet, we're talking about virtual reality. Okay, when you put on the headset, and yes, you can walk around, you can look around, you can be that avatar as in Ready Player One, or even to the extreme, Keanu Reeves.
Matrix.
The Matrix,
Yeah.
yeah, The Matrix, which is the ultimate virtual reality, which brings you right back into community because you have the three-dimensionality of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are the three-dimensionality of virtual reality. That might take care of some of these problems of disembodiment. So that's something that that the church should pay attention to. It's the next step beyond Zoom. Not just see what's going on, but you feel like you're there. And the shiny object thing, that what you have to do is make sure that there's a shiny object to keep people's attention, to steer them back. That's absolutely true. That's true in teaching. And it's something in worship that mega churches have realized. That's why they have the big screens with projected images. And very rarely in a worship center or a mega church. Are there any around here?
Mega churches?
Yeah.
In my,
Yeah, like Lancaster, LBC.
LCBC.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what they do is the pastors almost never speak for more than 3 minutes. They'll give a mini sermon, and then they'll have a skit, or they'll have a musical interlude, or there will be some or there'll be a little short film projected, so that there's a variety of sensory forms, and they shift quickly, so that people stay riveted, and that seems to work. And it's also what I didn't mention was also the multitasking phenomenon, that you mentioned all the things going on in your head, and that's becoming more and more common, where many of my students can perform 3 different tasks at the same time. I'm not sure how well they're performing them, but they're engaging in 3 different tasks at the same time. And a testimony of that, somebody did a study of responses. I wonder if you're familiar with this, Chuck E. Cheese.
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever gone to a Chuck E. Cheese with a kid, there are It's sensory overload on steroids, where there are flashing lights everywhere and animatronics are moving and there's different music, and there are light shows. Folk my age report going in there and getting a headache, you know, and feeling nauseous and confused. Kids don't. They're used to that. So they go into something that for an older person would be extremely disorienting sensory overload, but children can handle it. They're used to it. So think of somebody, a young person, who thinks that Chuck E. Cheese is normal, you know, or is the norm, yeah, and then they come to a worship service. The disconnect is vast.
Or when you give an exam, would it be like exams I remember in college? How do you do exams?
Wish they were. No, no, they're not. There can be a written component, like, you know, here's one question, write an essay and take 10 minutes. But then there's usually an oral part, and we'll talk through something, or some of my colleagues are even experimenting with, we'll draw a picture or a poem, or, you know, compose a song, to mix it all up. But the notion of, you know, when I was still in school, probably some of you, there were the notorious blue books.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah. You know, where you'd go in a room for 3 hours and here are the questions, write in your blue book until the bell goes. Yeah, that's pretty much a thing of the past.
What are we doing to train our educators to start teaching in this way?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, that's the $1 million question. Not enough is the short answer.
Do we know how?
No, I mean, the research is still young, the data is soft, and to tell the truth, technology changes so quickly that once you've figured out how to effectively use one kind, there's a new one. But most universities, and especially universities and colleges that have teaching programs in education, and seminaries too that train pastors, do have courses on electronic communication. Not all of them do, but many do. I'm not sure the quality of all of them, but the message is you've got to get on board with this, because the parishioners and Christians of the future are accustomed to this. Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. No, go.
No, I'm done.
Oh, well, so you talk about the mega churches and the screens. What, as a religion perspective, what's lost though in the religious experience with the lack of, say, ritual, pomp and circumstance? And is there,
Yeah, a very good question. I mean, there is a lot to be said about physical rituals, which are difficult to, it's kind of awkward to just do it at home, even if you know everybody else is doing it in their homes. There is something about being together, you know, standing up at the same time, singing at the same time, saying the same prayers at the same time in one another's company. There's something powerful about that, and that's hard to replicate virtually. Maybe with avatars and virtual universes that might be possible, but and as someone who teaches theology courses, the absence of logic is troubling. Like, well, you know, like this Bible verse says this, and this other Bible verse says this. So how do you put them together? And students are typically saying, well, I don't. They're both nice. Or, you know, if you have believed this, does that imply this other principle? And often they won't see it. If you commit yourself to proposition A, that implies proposition B, and you should affirm that too. So it does makes Christian belief fragmented.